Today is Africa Day, when the Organization of African Unity was formed. This year's commemoration comes at a time when many countries on the continent face possible food insecurity. This due to the war in Ukraine. For more on this now, we're joined by Chris Elserbrook, Director of the Center for Leadership Ethics in Africa at Fort Hare University. Dr. Chris, thank you so much for your time this morning, and good morning to you. Let's start with the reality in the continent when it comes to food insecurity. What are the numbers telling us, and just research in all regions of the continent? Are we food secure?
No, in fact, this day of which marks the beginning of the Organization of African Unity is supposed to be celebrating independence and unity. And what the war in Ukraine has exposed is that we are not independent but dependent, and not unified but in conflict. There's a serious problem for the sovereignty of African countries in terms of food security and nutrition. For instance, 70% of Kenyans are feed insecure, 70% drop in crops with climate change problems. Egypt, 80% of Egypt's grain came from the Black Sea region before this war, and it's caused a serious problem. And in fact, because of food security problems up the Nile, in Ethiopia, they've dammed up half the Nile recently. And so there's increasingly dire prospects in Egypt for them to feed themselves and to remain, in any sense, independent.
How does South Africa fare?
South Africa, we're fortunate, but we're sort of sleepwalking into a problem here. I don't know. We've got a very poor military, but we also have a massive dependence in South Africa. Both the nation is dependent on outside imports. A quarter of our grain came from the Black Sea region, but 50% of our wheat comes from outside. So we're not producing enough, and we're dependent. We're dependent on government, on a bloated government, and also on a very concentrated agribusiness cartels in this country.
Yeah. So since 1963, if I may just interject there, sorry, Doc, since 1963, with the formation of the Organization of the African Union, and to date, how much more time do you think, or how much longer is my question, do you think we'll still be dependent on other countries, other nations for food?
Well, we'll continue to remain dependent. I think part of the illusions that were exposed over the last 30 years is that simply proclaiming political independence does not make you independent. And it's up to the people. The nation doesn't just simply become independent by proclamation. It's the people that make up the nation that need to become independent. We can't just be dependent on this generally a fictional sovereign state. South Africa's existed for just over 100 years, and it's coming apart at the seams. The provinces are pulling apart. And we could go back to much more, it's not within very recent memory. I mean, 45 years ago, Biko was murdered here in the Eastern Cape, and the remains of the Black community programs that he and the Black consciousness movement initiated are all over the place.
Right.
Well, you can still see the remains, but they're historic remains. They're not living. We're not living our African heritage, and it's that would make us independent.
Yeah. I want to just touch on the aid that Africa is still very much dependent on. This besides trade, we know the United Nations, among the big, organizations responsible for food aid within the continent, shifting, of course, food to countries such as Yemen, Ethiopia, South Sudan. Those are just some of the few countries I've mentioned within the continent. But now that we understand they have to redirect those resources to Ukraine due to this conflict, what does that mean then for the rest of the continent? How can we then find ways, do you recommend, to ensure that food insecurity does not affect us in the long term?
Well, we've become dangerously dependent on grains, on corn, basically, on wheat and maize. And we don't eat enough vegetables. You'll find we have large tracts of land that are either sugar or mealies or canola oil. and these things have gone through the roof. They're massive staples. But we can grow, we need to rely on more variety. We can grow more vegetables. Here in the Eastern Cape, certainly, we don't feed ourselves, but we can. We have the land and enough water and resources to feed ourselves. But it depends on less dependence on highly concentrated agribusiness and government, and more variety in our diets in terms of eating more variety of vegetables and things that people used to grow.
Right, and I'm glad you mentioned government there, because I have to let you go in a few seconds. Before I do, by the mention of government, is there enough government support through policy for farmers to continue to, farm and ensure they secure food, getting resources, infrastructure? I mean, we were looking at KZN, even though they're not, the biggest agricultural province. However, the impact of weather, storms, rain, is there support to further cushion, farmers so that they can, of course, bridge the gap in growing our food?
Look, there can be no end of support. In fact, South Africa, the state is very active with support, although it's often very incompetent. It's often very incompetent, and as soon as the state responds, it often involves tenders, and as soon as there's tenders, the money just dries up. So it's a mistake to believe you can just throw money at the problem. It's not that we're necessarily short of money to throw at the problem, though we are running out. It's about disciplined cooperation. And I think it's this problem of dependence, seeing the state as a solution and not us as the state.
Right. Well, I have to leave it there, and I appreciate you speaking to us this morning. Dr. Chris Alsobrook, Director of the Centre for Leadership Ethics in Africa, thank you so much for your time.